June 4th, 1942. A massive Japanese armada steams toward an isolated Pacific atoll, its commanders absolutely confident they possess the element of total surprise. But in a windowless basement in Hawaii, Commander Joseph Rochefort and his exhausted cryptanalysts stare at a partially decrypted message. They have just confirmed the enemy's next target is AF. They have mathematically proven the Imperial Japanese Navy is unwittingly sailing straight into an ambush. Knowing the enemy's plan was a monumental intelligence achievement, but turning a trap into a victory against an unstoppable war machine would require desperate gambles, heavy sacrifices, and blind luck. For decades, the Battle of Midway has been remembered as a perfectly orchestrated American masterstroke, a brilliant trap sprung by a clever, underdog navy. But the historical reality is far more terrifying. This was not a flawless execution of a grand strategy. It was a chaotic, highly disorganized collision dictated by shattered codes, fatal assumptions, and razor-thin margins of time. We are going to strip away the popular legend to examine how a staggering chain of mutual errors and agonizing delays ultimately erased 4 elite Japanese aircraft carriers in a single morning. How did a severely outnumbered American fleet turn what should have been a complete catastrophe into one of the most consequential naval clashes in history? To understand the sheer magnitude of that gamble, we have to look at the desperate, bleeding state of the United States Navy just 6 months after the devastation of Pearl Harbor. By the spring of 1942, the Imperial Japanese Navy was an unstoppable juggernaut. Across the Pacific and the Indian Ocean, Japanese forces had swept aside every Allied fleet they encountered, projecting power with an elite, battle-hardened carrier striking force. The architect of this offensive, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, recognized that America's industrial might would eventually overwhelm Japan. His only hope for a decisive victory was to force the remnants of the U.S. Pacific Fleet into a final, crushing engagement before American shipyards could replace their early losses. The tiny, sand-spit atoll of Midway, sitting barely 1,000 miles northwest of Hawaii, was the perfect bait. Yamamoto knew the Americans would have to defend it, but Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, was preparing to spring a trap of his own, armed with the fragments of the cracked JN-25 code. Yet, acting on this intelligence was a terrifying strategic gamble. The intercepted messages were not perfectly translated blueprints. They were jigsaw puzzles, missing half their pieces. If the cryptanalysts in the basement had misinterpreted the Japanese objectives or the timing of the attack, Nimitz would be sending his only remaining naval shield into a blind execution, leaving the entire American West Coast vulnerable. The sheer desperation of the American position was most evident in Dry Dock Number 1 at Pearl Harbor. Nimitz needed every flight deck he could find. He had the Enterprise and the Hornet, but they were vastly outnumbered by the approaching Japanese armada. The aircraft carrier USS Yorktown had just limped into port from the Battle of the Coral Sea, trailing a 12-mile oil slick. She was suffering from massive internal damage, ruptured bulkheads, and a cracked flight deck. Navy engineers estimated it would take 3 months to make her combat ready. Nimitz gave them 3 days. In a display of frantic, continuous labor, over 1,400 civilian shipyard workers swarmed the Yorktown around the clock. The electrical grid of Honolulu was strained just to power their welding arcs. When Nimitz ordered the carrier back to sea after just 72 hours, the repairs were still incomplete. The Yorktown sailed out of the harbor with civilian mechanics and welders still below decks, actively patching her hull as she steamed toward the combat zone. Despite the intelligence breakthrough and the miraculous repair of the Yorktown, both fleets were sailing toward a confrontation where they would be operating essentially in the dark. In 1942, naval warfare was severely restricted by the limitations of early technology. Radar was still in its infancy, highly temperamental, and completely absent on the Japanese carriers. Both sides relied heavily on scout planes, flying long, lonely search vectors over millions of square miles of empty ocean. It was a deeply flawed system, where a single broken radio, a stray cloud bank, or a navigation error could blind an entire fleet. This was not going to be a clean, calculated chess match over a pristine board. It was going to be a knife fight in a pitch-black room where every command decision was a roll of the dice. By June 3rd, the three American carriers had quietly slipped into a waiting position northeast of Midway, an intercept sector they ominously codenamed Point Luck. Hundreds of miles to the west, the massive Japanese striking force sailed onward under absolute radio silence, their commanders entirely convinced that the American fleet was anchored safely back in Hawaii. As the sun rose on June 4th, the trap was set, but the unpredictable fog of war was about to throw the strict plans of both commanders into absolute chaos. At dawn on June 4th, Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo launched over 100 aircraft toward Midway. Standing on the bridge of the flagship Akagi, Nagumo expected an uncontested bombing run. But as his pilots broke through the clouds over the atoll, they were met by a ferocious anti-aircraft barrage and American fighter planes. The defenses were fully alert. The Japanese strike leader urgently radioed back. A second attack wave was required to neutralize the island. Bound by strict imperial doctrine, Nagumo ordered his reserve planes, currently armed with armor-piercing torpedoes for ship combat, to be taken below and rearmed with heavy land bombs. But at 7:28 a.m., a frantic transmission shattered the calm on the Akagi. A Japanese scout plane, operating on a 30-minute delay due to a broken catapult, had spotted something impossible. 10 ships, apparently enemy, are sighted. Nagumo faced a terrifying dilemma. Did those ships include an aircraft carrier? The scout pilot couldn't immediately confirm. For critical, agonizing minutes, the Japanese operational timetable collapsed. Caught between finishing off Midway and preparing to engage an unknown fleet, Nagumo issued a fatal, reversing order. Halt the bomb loading and switch back to torpedoes. Below decks, exhausted mechanics scrambled to detach heavy land bombs, leaving the volatile ordnance unsecured on the enclosed hangar floors to save time. In his hesitation to secure the perfect armament, Nagumo inadvertently created a narrow window of extreme vulnerability, transforming his elite carriers into floating powder kegs. Yet, as his crews frantically swapped weapons, the admiral was completely unaware that his time had already run out. The Americans had not waited. A desperate counterattack had already been launched, but this hasty, uncoordinated strike was rapidly turning into a slaughter. The American strike did not begin as a coordinated fist, but rather as a desperate, disjointed gamble. Aboard the USS Enterprise and Hornet, Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance had made a cold-blooded, aggressive calculation. Instead of waiting for his entire air group to launch and form up in the skies above the fleet, the standard, practiced doctrine of naval aviation, Spruance ordered his planes to proceed toward the Japanese as soon as they were airborne. He knew that catching Nagumo's carriers while their decks were cluttered with aircraft was the only mathematical way the outgunned Americans could win. Time was suddenly more valuable than coordination. But launching over 100 aircraft from pitching wooden decks was an agonizingly slow, mechanical process. Because radio silence was strictly enforced to avoid detection, the squadrons could not communicate once in the air. The result was a logistical nightmare. Fighters lost their bombers in the sprawling cloud cover. Dive bomber commanders disagreed on the enemy's exact heading and took the verging flight paths over the open ocean. The American armada fractured into isolated, wandering groups. This breakdown in communication guaranteed that the United States Navy would arrive over the Japanese fleet piecemeal, attacking in small, unsupported waves, effectively destroying any chance of a synchronized strike. The first to find the enemy were also the most vulnerable. Breaking out from the low cloud ceiling, Torpedo Squadron 8, led by the fiercely stubborn Lieutenant Commander John C. Waldron, spotted the distinct white wakes of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Waldron had engaged in a bitter pre-flight argument with his air group commander over the enemy's projected location. Trusting his own navigational instincts, Waldron had broken away from the main American formation, flying a completely independent search pattern. He was right. He had found the Japanese carriers, but he had found them entirely alone. Waldron's men flew the Douglas TBD Devastator. Even by the aviation standards of 1942, it was a desperately obsolete machine. It was heavily underpowered, painfully sluggish, and utterly lacking in modern defensive armor. To deploy their primary weapon, the 2,000-pound Mark 13 torpedo, the pilots were forced to execute a terrifyingly rigid maneuver. They had to descend to a mere 50 feet above the churning ocean waves, throttle their engines back to an agonizingly slow, 100 miles per hour and fly in a dead straight, predictable line for several miles to give the torpedo's internal gyroscope time to stabilize in the water. They were supposed to be escorted by a protective umbrella of high-altitude Wildcat fighters, but those fighters had taken a wrong turn and were currently miles away, burning precious fuel over an empty ocean. Waldron looked up at the empty sky, fully aware that he and his 15 crews were completely exposed. It was a guaranteed suicide run. Yet, without hesitation, he broke radio silence with a final, terse command. He ordered his squadron to attack. As the Devastators dropped to the deck and skimmed the wave tops, the Japanese fleet erupted. Battleships, cruisers, and destroyers opened up with a massive, coordinated wall of anti-aircraft fire. The sky turned black with shrapnel, and towering geysers of water shot up around the low-flying Americans as heavy naval shells slammed into the sea. But the surface barrage wasn't the primary danger. The true threat was circling thousands of feet above. The elite Japanese Combat Air Patrol, consisting of dozens of Mitsubishi A6M0 fighters, had spotted the dark shapes crawling just above the water. These Zero pilots were the most experienced, lethal aviators in the world, hardened by years of combat over China and the Indian Ocean. With the flick of a stick, they pushed their noses down and dove toward the sea. What followed was not a battle, it was a mechanical execution. The speed and maneuverability of the Zeros vastly outclassed the lumbering American bombers. The Japanese aces slashed through Waldron's formation, pouring 20-millimeter cannon fire into the unarmored fuselages. The Devastators were torn to shreds, their fuel tanks igniting instantly. One by one, they transformed into fiery comets, slamming violently into the Pacific. Lieutenant Commander Waldron's plane was one of the first to be destroyed, consumed in a ball of flame. Out of the 15 aircraft in Torpedo Squadron 8, all 15 were shot down. Out of the 30 men who flew into the Inferno, 29 were killed. Only Ensign George Gay survived, splashing into the sea and hiding under a floating black rubber seat cushion as the battle raged violently around him. The sacrifice did not end there. Moments later, Torpedo Squadron 6 from the Enterprise arrived on the scene, followed shortly by Torpedo Squadron 3 from the Yorktown. Like Waldron's men, they were uncoordinated, unescorted, and flying the exact same obsolete aircraft. And exactly like Waldron's men, they pressed their attacks directly into the gauntlet of tracer fire and swarming Zeros. The American pilots flew with an unflinching, terrifying devotion to duty, holding their aircraft perfectly steady as pieces of their wings, tails, and canopies were systematically shot away by the Japanese fighters. But the raw courage of the aviators could not overcome the catastrophic failure of American military technology. The few Devastators that actually managed to survive the gauntlet and press the release button found that their Mark 13 torpedoes were fundamentally defective. The weapons splashed into the water and either ran too deep, veering harmlessly under the Japanese keels, spun wildly off course, or struck the enemy hulls with a dull metallic thud and simply failed to detonate. Out of dozens of torpedoes dropped by the three squadrons, not a single one scored a hit. The ocean surface was soon littered with burning aviation fuel, floating debris, and the shattered remains of 41 American bombers. It was a complete tactical massacre. From the flag bridge of the Japanese aircraft carrier Akagi, Admiral Nagumo and his aviation commander, Minoru Genda, watched the slaughter unfold. When the first American torpedo planes had unexpectedly appeared on the horizon, a sharp jolt of anxiety had undeniably run through the Japanese command staff. They were caught mid-rearmament, their flight decks were vulnerable, and the sudden realization that an American carrier was indeed lurking in the vicinity could have sparked widespread panic. But as the agonizing minutes ticked by, the tension on the Akagi evaporated, rapidly replaced by a profound sense of supreme confidence. The Japanese commanders watched with growing pride through their binoculars as their combat air patrol dismantled the American strike with terrifying, mechanical efficiency. The Zeros were performing flawlessly, dancing effortlessly around the slow, desperate American bombers. Down below, the defensive screen of heavily armed destroyers and cruisers was shifting seamlessly, executing high-speed evasive turns to avoid the pathetic, scattered torpedo drops. To Nagumo and his veteran officers, this chaotic, piecemeal American attack proved exactly what the Imperial Japanese Navy had always believed. The enemy was fundamentally, technologically, and tactically inferior. The Americans clearly lacked operational coordination. Their aircraft were hopelessly outmatched, and their command decisions were deeply flawed. Japanese officers and crewmen on the fleet's decks openly cheered and applauded as each burning American plane hit the water, viewing the spectacle more like target practice than a legitimate military threat. By 10:15 a.m., the heavy guns of the Japanese fleet finally began to fall silent. The dark skies cleared of smoke. The last of the torpedo bombers had been ruthlessly swatted from the air. The immediate, terrifying threat was completely annihilated. Inside the Japanese fleet, a profound, heavy sense of relief washed over the thousands of sailors and mechanics. They had successfully weathered the storm. They had absorbed the absolute best punch the United States Navy could possibly throw at them. A desperate three-carrier combined strike, and not a single Japanese warship had taken a scratch. Now, the tables were turned. Now, it was their time to dictate the terms of the Pacific War. Admiral Nagumo's previously agonizing, delayed rearming orders were finally nearing completion. Below decks in the massive, enclosed hangars, the frantic chaos of swapping munitions was giving way to lethal precision. The deadly Nakajima Type 97 attack bombers and Aichi D-3 Naval dive bombers, now fully armed with ship-killing aerial torpedoes and massive armor-piercing bombs, were rapidly being hoisted up the mechanical elevators to the wooden flight decks of all four fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. The massive strike force that would hunt down and permanently sink the American carriers was actively being spotted for launch. Mechanics rushed frantically around the tightly packed aircraft to top off fuel tanks, snaking highly volatile aviation gas hoses across the decks. Munitions that had not yet been returned to the heavily armored lower magazines, dozens of heavy land bombs from the aborted Midway strike, were simply pushed against the bulkhead walls and lashed down to quickly clear space for the launching aircraft. The decks of the Japanese carriers were incredibly crowded, vibrating with the roar of hundreds of warming radial engines and brimming with thousands of pounds of explosive potential. But the Japanese commanders felt completely invincible. Looking out over the calm waters and the clear skies, they were absolutely convinced that the American threat was entirely neutralized. The enemy's air power was broken, their fighters were nowhere to be seen, and their torpedo planes were burning on the ocean floor. In less than 10 minutes, the Japanese fleet would launch a devastating counterstrike that would wipe the U.S. Navy from the Pacific Ocean forever. The Japanese fleet stood on the edge of total victory, unaware that the brutal massacre of the American torpedo squadrons at sea level had just opened a fatal, unguarded door in the sky. The massacre of the American torpedo squadrons seemed like a flawless Japanese victory, but it triggered a catastrophic chain reaction. To slaughter the low-flying devastators, the elite Japanese combat air patrol had dove directly to the wave-tops. Dozens of Zeros were now swarming near sea level, completely abandoning their high-altitude patrol zones. The Japanese had unknowingly left the sky above 10,000 feet entirely empty. At that exact moment, two lost squadrons of American dive bombers, led by Lieutenant Commander C. Wade McCluskey, were burning through their final reserves of aviation gas. They had flown to their assigned intercept coordinates, only to find an endless expanse of empty ocean. With his pilot's fuel gauges dropping dangerously close to zero, doctrine dictated that McCluskey turn back immediately or condemn his men to ditch in the sea. But looking down through a break in the scattered clouds, McCluskey spotted a single, faint white streak cutting across the water. It was a lone Japanese destroyer, the Arashi. It had lingered behind to depth charge an American submarine and was now steaming at flank speed to catch up with Admiral Nagumo's main fleet. With his tanks almost dry, McCluskey made a blind, monumental gamble. He banked his bombers and followed the lone ship's wake into the unknown. Desperate navigation, failing fuel supplies, and pure blind luck were about to converge at the exact same moment over the Pacific Ocean. Following the wake of the Arashi, McCluskey's squadrons broke through the scattered clouds at 14,000 feet. Below them, bathed in bright morning sunlight, lay the pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy. And just as the tragic sacrifice of the torpedo squadrons had dictated, the sky above the fleet was completely empty of enemy fighters. At exactly 10:22 a.m., the American Dauntless dive bombers pushed their noses down. They plummeted out of the sky in a near-vertical dive, dropping completely unopposed. Down on the flight decks, Japanese crews were moments away from launching their own massive strike when lookouts finally looked up and screamed desperate warnings. It was too late. In the span of just 5 catastrophic minutes, heavy armor-piercing bombs smashed through the wooden flight decks of the Kaga, the Soryu, and Admiral Nagumo's flagship, the Akagi. Under normal circumstances, these magnificent warships might have survived a few direct hits, but Nagumo's agonizing delays had transformed his carriers into floating powder kegs. The American bombs detonated inside the enclosed hangars, instantly igniting the unsecured land bombs, the snaking aviation gas hoses, and the tightly packed, fully fueled strike aircraft. A devastating chain reaction of secondary explosions ripped the heart out of the 3 massive ships, instantly transforming them into blazing, uncontrollable infernos. Out of the 4 elite Japanese carriers, only the Hiryu, sailing further out of formation, escaped the initial 5-minute onslaught. Desperate for retaliation, her commander launched a hasty, fatal counterstrike that successfully tracked down and crippled the already battered USS Yorktown. But the Hiryu's reprieve was agonizingly brief. Later that evening, American dive bombers found her, delivering a fatal payload that turned the final Japanese flight deck into a raging firestorm. By nightfall, the burning hulks of 4 elite carriers were slipping beneath the waves. The impossible ambush had succeeded, but the cost was staggering. Thousands of miles away from the burning oil slicks, Commander Joseph Rochefort and his exhausted cryptanalysts remained at their desks in that windowless basement in Hawaii. Their mathematical brilliance in cracking the JN-25 code had undeniably set the stage for the ambush, allowing Admiral Nimitz to properly position his vastly outnumbered ships. But the silent, intellectual triumph of naval intelligence did not actually sink the Japanese fleet. The victory was paid for in the blood of the slaughtered torpedo squadrons, and it was ultimately decided by failing fuel gauges, a stray destroyer, and split-second timing, not a flawless, guaranteed master plan. The events of June 4th, 1942, did not instantly end the Pacific War. Years of grueling, heavily contested island-hopping campaigns still lay ahead for the United States. Yet, the strategic balance of the ocean had violently and permanently shifted. In a single morning, Japan lost 4 elite fleet carriers and hundreds of irreplaceable veteran aviators. It was a devastating blow that their shipyards and training programs could never replace, permanently shattering Japan's capacity for large-scale naval offensives. The sudden destruction of an unstoppable armada revealed a terrifying reality of combat. It proved that even the most formidable, highly disciplined war machine in the world is fatally vulnerable to friction. Ultimately, the Battle of Midway stands as a brutal reminder of how quickly history can pivot upon the smallest of details. In the chaotic, unforgiving fog of war, the absolute might of a massive empire was completely unraveled by a single cracked code, 1 delayed scout plane, and just 5 minutes of unguarded sky.